who's first?
Maddie, you can start.
Yeah, I'll take it away. All right. So for those of you who don't know me, hi, my name's Maddie. I'm the new School 2 career intern, and I will be introducing our speaker. Mr. William Jones is the founder of Afrofuturism Network. He is a historian and comic book geek, writer, and educator. He is a sought-after public speaker on the subjects of the history of Black people in America, the image of Black people in various forms of media, pop culture, and hip-hop music, just to name a few. He has spoken on various college campuses and at conferences, both nationally and abroad. All right, and give a warm welcome to Mr. William Jones.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to Mr. Jeremy and Stallworth, and thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate that. I'm really honored to come before you guys and interact with you and talk with you. And essentially what I want to talk about today is give you a little bit of what I do and also speak to some of your aspirations. I want to hear from you guys just as much as I'm doing the talking. I don't want to do all the talking here. So I really want to get some feedback from you. But with that being said, I just want to start talking a little bit about what I do and who I am. So once again, my name is William Jones, and yes, I am a comic book geek. Are there any comic geeks out there? Anyone enjoying comic books, science fiction, fantasy, things of that nature? Excellent. I see some thumbs up. So what happened was there's this phrase. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the term Afrofuturism. And while I'm doing the presentation, I do not mind if you guys ask questions, if you respond, and so forth. So that works fine for me. So if you want to unmute yourself and you just want to chime in with, questions, whatever the case might be, by all means do so. But the question I get a lot is, what exactly is an Afrofuturist? So let me just bring this up real quick. If you'll take a look at my screen behind me, this is my company's logo. The name of my company is Afrofuturism Network. And in terms of what Afrofuturism is, it was actually a term that was coined back in the 90s, okay? And it was a reporter that came up with the phrase, and basically what he was looking at was this space where Black creators, Black content, Black characters existed in the realms of science fiction, fantasy, comic books, and so forth. And the phrase was created in the 90s, but what I realized for myself was I was an Afrofuturist pretty much from the day I was born. I've always had a love of comic books, cartoons, and so forth. But, you know, as a young Black person growing up looking at those mediums, you always kind of wondered, where did you fit in? A lot of young people today, you guys are very lucky and fortunate that you have so much content out there. You're introduced to so many characters, so many creators, and so forth, that it's a lot easier to see your place in these spaces than it was years ago. So for myself, I've always loved comic books. I've always loved history. And this gave me an opportunity to put those two things together. You know, and one of the things that I want to talk to you guys about is this idea of finding your passion, finding what it is that you want to do, what you love, what you enjoy. And for myself, this was like a journey for me, but it was kind of weird because I was always at the destination, but I didn't quite know it at the time. And what I mean by that is what you will find is sometimes you have a particular passion or a love of something, and you're busy trying to figure out, where do you fit in? And you're trying to figure out ways that you kind of force yourself into certain spaces. But what I want to tell you is, whatever it is that you have a love and interest or passion for, that is your space, and that's where you belong. One of the things that happened for me was, for example, as I was growing up, and I was sharing this with Mr. Jeremy and Mr. Stallworth, when it was time for me to go to college, and I know that's where you are right now. The question is, what are you going to major in? And my first reaction was, I want to be a mechanical engineer. Why do I want to be a mechanical engineer? Two reasons. Number one, I wanted to make robots. That should have told me something right there. Number two was, I heard that's where the money was at. And that's what I got into it for. But when I got to college, I discovered that there was this thing called math that you really had to be good at. And I was like, okay, this is not building robots. I don't get this. Once there were more letters than numbers, I kind of fell behind in math. And I really got frustrated with the process. And I had actually dropped out of school, like really briefly. It took for as long as my mom to find out. before I went back in. So what happened was when, you know, I had dropped out because engineering was not working for me. I wasn't happy. And I just felt like I didn't belong. And then the question was put to me, well, what do you do when no one else is asking you to do it? And the answer was, well, I'm always reading history books. I always had a love of it since high school. This was something that I always was interested in. I was doing presentations on it on a college campus. This was what I was doing with my own personal time. So then it was like, well, why don't you just major in history? And that's what I did. I majored in history, ended up going to graduate school, ended up becoming a history teacher, okay, because of my love and my passion for it. All right, so my message to you on that is, wherever you are, whatever it is you're taking an interest in, follow that path. I was surprised when I looked up and I Googled following your passion, and I came across so many articles that actually recommended that people don't do that. And I was surprised at that. And my advice to you, and that's all it is advice, is whatever it is you're interested in, whatever it is you're passionate about, I would strongly recommend you follow that, because ultimately what that will do for you is it may put you on a different path. You might say, for example, you might be passionate about singing and you may want to be a professional singer. By all means, follow that dream. But what you may discover is in the process, someone might approach you and say, well, I love the way you presented on stage. I love the way you commanded the stage. Have you ever thought about public speaking? Have you ever thought about being an actor or an actress? So it may end up that your passion actually moves you in a certain direction, but it's the initial following of that passion that puts you on that path. For me, it was like a weight was lifted off of my back when I discovered what it was I really wanted to do. So fast forward, as I'm moving through graduate school, the time comes when you got to do your research and you got to write about something. I'm racking my brain trying to figure it out, and my focus was African studies. And I'm trying to figure it out. And once again, I went back to that old advice that I got. What do you do when no one's asking you to do it? And it was watching cartoons, reading comic books, anime, and so forth. So that gave me an opportunity to put the two worlds together, okay, where I was able to take my love of history, my love of comic books, popular culture, put that together into research, all right? Out of that, I discovered this phrase, Afrofuturism. Now, like I said, the term itself was discovered it came about, I should say, it was coined in the 90s, but that does not say that Black people have not been contributing to the realms of science fiction, fantasy, and so forth for years prior. One of the earliest that I recall, actually, many people don't talk about this, but W.E.B. Du Bois actually had written science fiction. Okay, he had written about a meteorite striking the earth or coming to the earth and so forth. There's been Black speculative fiction going back many years. A book called Blake, or the Huts of America, where they're looking at revolutionary activity in Black communities across the world and so forth. So Black folk were always in this space. It's just that because of, you know, the society and the world that we live in, we were always marginalized and our voices weren't heard. So then I began to discover this whole history of Black participation in what came to be known as Afrofuturism. And it expands well beyond just comic books and film. We're talking music, we're talking fashion, okay? Now with the advent of video and so forth, you're seeing this definition of Afrofuturism constantly expand. And for me, it was just this joy that I felt in researching it, in reading it, because it wasn't work for me, okay? You know, I'm reading a stack of comics. Folks are saying, what are you doing? I say, I'm doing research. You know, I have to take trips to comic book conventions. What are you doing? I'm trying to work on my business with that, okay? And out of that, this idea for this business was born, because actually I had written a paper on the subject of Black representation in science fiction and fantasy films. And I actually ended up delivering that paper in Croatia. There was a conference on racism, and I submitted my paper, and I was actually brought out to Croatia to deliver this paper. And I remember I brought a friend along with me, and he saw this, and he was like, man, this is you. This is what you got to do. So this actually began to take me into different spaces simply because I had a love and a passion for it. My love of film, what they refer to as blaxploitation. I don't know if you guys know that term, but if you ever heard of Shaz, Superfly, and all those guys, all of those films, and Pam Grier and so forth, all of those films together, coming together, was known as blaxploitation. I actually ended up presenting on blaxploitation in Cambridge University in the UK. So my point to you is, your passion, your love of something can actually take you places that you never even imagined. I didn't know that in England they were interested in learning about Shad and Superfly and Pam Grier. I didn't know that in Croatia that they would be, stunned to learn about the history of Storm, Luke Cage, Black Panther, and so forth. So I can't say this enough. What you love, what you want to do, I strongly recommend that you guys follow that to its end. And you'll be surprised at how much success and happiness you're going to have with that. Ultimately, my research came together and I ended up writing a book. I'm going to see if I can get this up here. I don't know if it's showing up on the screen. Oh, let me try it again. There we go. Is that better? All right. Ex-con, I think it's in the slide presentation, will come up. Ex-con, Voodoo Priest, Goddess, and the African King, where I analyzed the history of Luke Cage, Black Panther, Storm, and a character by the name of Papa Midnight. And I put these Black comic book characters in their historic perspective. So what I found was, for example, I started to look for parallels between history and comic books. And what I found was when you had these stereotypical representations of Black characters in the real world, we were also being marginalized and described and depicted as such in various forms of media. And when you had these moments of civil rights and upheaval, you start to see a change within the pages of comic books. So when you look at a character like the Black Panther, Luke Cage, Storm, and so forth, they were all birthed around the same time period, which was when in the aftermath of the civil rights era. So those kind of changes were not accidental. So this gave me an opportunity to put history in the context that would make it more digestible, perhaps, for some folks that ordinarily wouldn't be interested in history, okay? So, like I said, these kind of things worked themselves out for me, and it gave me an opportunity, and it ends up ultimately putting me in front of you guys, okay? So, like I said, you don't know where it's gonna take you, but I strongly recommend you follow it. So what am I talking about in terms of analyzing Black characters in comic books and so forth? I wanna show you a slide. Let me see, it's coming up. There we go. All right, everybody know these guys? The Simpsons, right? So when I need answers to life's questions, I always turn to the Simpsons, all right? One episode of the Simpsons, they had a very interesting episode where they ended up in jail. I forgot what happened. Homer did something, I don't recall. But they end up in jail. And while they were in prison, they're visited by this character. He's draped in white and he walks in, and Homer automatically assumes that this guy is God or an angel and so forth. He starts talking to him like he's God or some type of angel. And the wife says to him, you have to excuse my husband. He's seen too many movies. So the question is, what was she talking about? And what she was talking about was this thing, this phenomena in writing called the magical Negro. I don't know if you guys ever heard of this phrase, but ultimately what this is in writing, you have this tradition where you have these Black characters that have supernatural abilities, some otherworldly gifts, but ultimately their gifts were always in service to a white character in the film, in the book, in the movie. And it becomes known as the magical Negro because what happens is these characters don't use their powers, their abilities to help themselves or other people in their community. What am I talking about? Some of these films you might have seen. Green Mile, I don't know if you've ever seen that film. Stephen King's book comes to the big screen. You got Tom Hanks portraying the police guard or whatever. And you have this character, this Black guy by the name of Coffee, okay? And what happens is Coffee is accused of a crime he did not commit. And he's put on death row, the Green Mile. He walks that last mile. But what they discover is that Coffee actually has magical abilities. He actually has powers. But if you watch the film or if you're familiar with the book, he doesn't use the power to free himself. He doesn't use the power to help anyone in his community. He uses the power to help Tom Hanks. And if you see the film, Tom Hanks really doesn't have that big of an issue. He has some, shall we say, intimacy issues with his wife. So for all the power that this character has, he uses it to service Tom Hanks's need and not his own. So that's one example of what is referred to as a magical Negro. So all of this came about just from my reading of history, my understanding of science fiction, fantasy, and so forth. So I began to look at these authors, these intellectuals that were tackling this issue, and I was looking for spaces where I fit in. And that's what research is really about. It's not about simply regurgitating what's out there. It's about you finding the gaps of what's missing and saying, well, I noticed that this was not being addressed or this was missing. okay? Another example is a film called Family Man, all right, where you have Nicolas Cage's character. Once again, this guy is wealthy, white man. He's done well in the world of business, right? But he's having like girlfriend trouble. I think he regretted not marrying his high school sweetheart. Big problem, right? Ultimately, you see Don Cheadle in the image. He plays the role of an angel. He visits Nicolas Cage. Once again, his biggest problem is he didn't marry the woman that he was in love with when he was in high school. So he gives him his power, his ability to go back and correct his romantic problems. Now, for all the issues that this character could have visited, for all the communities he could have visited, once again, his powers go in service to a white character, playing upon this, what they call stereotype of the magical Negro. And you see this time and time again, very famous film called Ghost. We have Whoopi Goldberg, who had the ability to communicate with the spirit world. She doesn't help her community. As a matter of fact, they kind of play her as a shyster, as a con woman, but ultimately she discovers she really does have this power. But does she help the members of her community? No. If you go back and watch the film, she actually shoos them away from the table at one point. Ultimately, her power goes to help reunite a couple, okay? This is Demi Moore is playing in the film, and I don't believe this, I'm blanking on his name. It'll come to me. She reunites this couple, and she's using her ability. What you got for me, Jeremy? You got a name? She reunites this couple, and she,
Sorry,
yes.
I was putting in the chat. It's Patrick Swayze.
Patrick Swayze, yes.
And he doesn't just use her powers, he takes over her body.
Exactly. So this is the kind of, no, it's quite all right. That's the kind of imagery and things that I was discussing in papers that I was writing about, where you have this black character who has this enormous power, but she basically becomes a pawn of the white couple when you look at it in a certain light. So these are the kind of patterns that I was talking about. You see the same thing with Bruce Almighty, okay? Where you got Morgan Freeman playing the role of God. And I would imagine if God had a voice, it would probably sound like Morgan Freeman, okay? But he helps out Jim Carrey. And if you watch the film, Jim Carrey's simply just mad at the world one day and decides, well, if he was God, he could fix things. So God comes down and gives him his power. So out of all the people in the world he could have visited, once again, you have this supernatural black character coming down, giving his powers to a white individual who really didn't even need the help to begin with, okay? Another example, Hancock. I don't know if you've seen this film. Will Smith, supernatural being, supernatural character, okay? If you watch the film, his weakness is literally a white female character, okay? So he has all of this power, but when he's in presence of the white female character, who's his, his love interest, he actually loses his power. So you have this literal embodiment of what some people refer to as the black man's kryptonite being shown on screen. I would find it very difficult to believe that Superman would ever be depicted being brought to his knees simply because he was in the presence of a black woman. So these are the kind of things that I'm talking about in my research and my studies and presentations such as these, okay? Now, that is not to say that black characters have always been what they refer to as the magical Negro. You have some examples throughout history and film. Film like Cabin in the Sky, this is going way back, this is even older than me, believe it or not, where you had this all black cast, where you had a black character, central black character, who had to kind of make this choice between heaven and hell, okay? And you had characters portraying, black characters portraying not only God, but also the devil, the angels, the demons, and so forth. So you do have these films, and even more so now, thankfully, you have more and more films of black characters being put on screen, but these are some early forerunners to these black characters that kind of broke the mold of the magical Negro. Denzel Washington actually played an angel in a remake of a film, okay, where he's the preacher's wife, where he actually comes to the assistance of a black couple. Brother from Another Planet, masterful film. If you ever get the chance to see this, we have this black character coming from outer space and so forth. Don't want to give too much away, but it's a black character and he's being chased, and that's all I'm gonna say about that because I don't want to ruin it. But he doesn't speak throughout the entire film, and he actually ends up in Harlem where he's helping out his community, okay? Meteor Man, I don't know if you've ever seen this. This is one of the first, if not the first, I see Mr. Jeremy, where you have this black superhero coming to the big screen. This is Robert Townsend's creation. And Robert Townsend, I believe, kind of got the point where if you watch the film, you have this black character who's actually using his powers to assist his community. There's a beautiful scene in the film where the community is actually what they refer to as a food desert. I don't know if you're familiar with these terms. The term food desert, but it's basically a community where you don't have access to stores or healthy foods. So what he does is he actually reaches in the earth in his own community and he grows vegetation. So I believe that Robert Townsend really got and understood that if you're going to have these Black characters, they're going to be in service to their communities, okay? Sometimes you have films such as this, science fiction film, which sets out to make one point, but if it's done improperly, it ends up kind of making the wrong point. This film is called District 9. And if you're familiar with the term apartheid in South Africa, this was a system, basically Jim Crow in South Africa. We had legalized segregation and oppression at the hands of the government. This film was made to attack that practice, but it ultimately ended up reinforcing stereotypes. So in the film, you have these aliens that crash land in Southern Africa and they're put into a community, a neighborhood, which was similar to the shanty towns of South Africa or the townships of South Africa. And they had to fend for themselves. These aliens were poor, they were destitute and so forth. But if you watch the film, the filmmaker actually ends up reinforcing a lot of the stereotypes. You have images of the African people eating aliens. You have images of the African people actually prostituting themselves to the aliens. So it actually ended up playing on a lot of the stereotypes that many Black folk were trying to get away from, so much so that in many parts of Africa, this film was actually banned, okay? So we already talked about Hancock, but I want to move on. Sometimes we see things in film and it's pretty subtle, okay? I love the Transformers, love the cartoon, grew up with the Transformers, but when it was brought to the big screen, some problematic images. So this is Revenge of the Fallen, all right? And what was interesting is if you've ever seen this film, it opens up and you have this ice cream truck driving down the street and it's using foul language for some strange reason. Some kids run up to it, they want to buy ice cream. These kids basically get cursed out. So they run away from the ice cream truck and the truck transforms into these two characters called Skids and Mudflap. And a lot of people found this image problematic because they could tell simply based on the language. That's the other thing we have to look at when we start to analyze literacy and so forth, is the voice that's given to these characters. If you notice, the character at the bottom actually has a gold tooth, okay? So you have this play on these stereotypical images when it comes to these characters. So like I said, these are the kind of things that I'm dealing with. I also look at history, love the film Captain America, love Marvel comic films. But one of the things I noticed here was they ignored the segregation in the military of the day. You know, they had this image where, you know, Captain America's come out of the 1940s, and you actually see him fighting side by side with a Black soldier. And with the exception of one battle towards the end of World War II, you did not have integration on the battlefield with US troops. Integration doesn't become a thing until the Korean War, where it becomes like, you know, officially disbanded, if you will. But in the film, if you're not careful, it gives the impression that Black troops and white troops were united and they were fighting on the battlefield together. So in the film, you see the character here in this comic book form, and you see him on the big screen. And like I said, you can get the impression that Black troops and white troops fought side by side. But if you study the history of World War II and the treatment of Black soldiers, you will find that in many instances, they were treated even worse than the German prisoners of war, okay? I always found it interesting that Captain America could wake up from the 1940s and the first face he sees is a Black face of authority and doesn't ask what happened. He doesn't ask, how did you get to this position where you would have a Black man like a Nick Fury come to a position of power? So I feel that sometimes these films, and once again, this is my own analysis, sometimes these films can, let's say, ignore certain problematic aspects of history. Now, thankfully, I've seen more and more filmmakers today making that correction, but these are just some of the examples that I found. Now, to show how it can work, if you ever go back and you watch the Avengers film, when Loki makes his presence known and he makes all these people bow down in the street, one guy stands up. If you see that old man in the back standing next to Captain America to his left, he stands up and he pretty much says to him, I will never take a knee to a man like you. I've seen men like you. Obviously, he's talking about Adolf Hitler, okay? So they can, when they want to, recognize past atrocities without it overtaking the film. But once again, I'm just drawing attention to where I see the gaps, okay? Blade, one of my favorite characters. This guy, Wesley Snipes playing Blade, basically is responsible for the resurgence of comic book films. But when the film came out, once again, being a comic fan, one of the things that I noticed was they changed one of the main characters. Blade was actually raised up by a blind Black musician and taught him how to fight vampires. But when they brought him to the screen, they changed him over to Whistler, Chris Christopherson, whom they created just for the film. So I found that problematic that you have Blade, who was absent of an actual father, but his father figure is replaced by this Black character, who I think would have been very interesting to see a blind musician, jazz musician, teaching this young boy to fight vampires, but they replaced him with Chris Christopherson, okay? Now we're seeing a lot more in film of race swapping and so forth when it comes to characters, especially in comic book and science fiction. But if we're not careful, a lot of history, a lot of culture can be lost when we do that, okay? In the original Blade film, you had Black supporting characters, okay? But by the time they get to the second and the third one, all of those characters are gone. So these are the things that start to happen now that the film has become popular. You jettison those Black characters that were key to the development of the plot in the original story, okay? Star Wars: The Force Awakens, okay? I don't know if there's any Star Wars fans. I won't get off in a rant about what I feel about these last 3 Star Wars movies. I see Mr. Jeremy. Exactly, yeah, I don't know about those. But what I found interesting was the character of Finn. And I began to look at and talk about his character in presentations long before they had gotten to the final film. And I found the way that he was portrayed problematic. I was excited to see Finn in the trailers. It looked as if he was going to be this Jedi / stormtrooper, you know, switching sides and so forth. But ultimately what I found in the film was a play on stereotypes. It was almost that they were fearful to portray him in too heroic of a light. If you go back, if you're familiar with the film, one of the things that we discovered was he was a janitor, okay? And I was like, well, how do you have this stormtrooper, would-be Jedi, but at the same time a janitor, play on this old stereotypes? And by the time you get to the end of the film series, he became a little more than comic relief, okay, and really pushed to the background. So much so that if you keep up with him and what he's talking about, recently he actually came out speaking about that very thing, and he's very critical of Disney, and this is within the last few months, okay? So these are the kind of things that we are looking at. So Luke Cage, one of my favorite superheroes, like I said, one of the subjects of my book. So when I watched the Netflix series, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to see if we could integrate some of our students a little bit.
Oh, please, yes. Any questions?
Hey, CEOs or anybody else who's on the call, but especially CEOs. Has anybody watched this show, might be able to comment on it and see what they picked up on before Mr. Will gives his expert opinion? Zamira, I know you're all about the Netflix superheroes, so I figured I'd call you up.
Oh.
Or Danielle or Jordan, I know you're the other animation folks in there. Has anybody seen this that might be able to comment on why this portrayal might be?
I've watched Jessica Jones and him, her,
Yes.
and they all got, like, I think they got a show together, but I haven't watched them separately.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, they did a crossover thing called The Defenders, where they were all on the same screen, and even Jessica Jones appeared in his show and vice versa. So they've constantly had the crossover. And the reason why they did that is because in the comic books, they actually got together and had a child. So they brought that relationship to the small screen in this case. What was interesting with Luke Cage, when I began to look at his history, and please, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to chime in. You're not cutting me off. That's what I'm looking for. So if anybody wants to chime in at any point, please do so. When I looked at Luke Cage, I first analyzed him in the page of the comics. And like I said, he was born out of what was called the blaxploitation era of films. And this is the films pretty much the early 1970s. What happened was Hollywood was dying. Hollywood was on its last leg. And what happened was you had this independent filmmaker by the name of Melvin Van Peebles. And he created this independent film called Sweetback. And I'll just get the abbreviated title, Sweetback. And what happens is he releases this on his own dime. This was done on a shoestring budget, and it goes on to make millions. So Hollywood then pays attention, like, oh my God, there's money in Black viewership. So you begin to have this explosion of Black films, and its term is coined blaxploitation. They call it blaxploitation because when the term first came up, it was not a complimentary one. You had critics within the NAACP that were saying these films were doing a little more than exploiting Black people and portraying them in a negative light. So what happens is Marvel Comics, DC Comics, they pay attention to this trend, and they end up creating Luke Cage and other Black comic book heroes that you're probably familiar with to this day. Luke Cage was kind of like a play on Shaft, all right, with superpowers. What I found interesting in looking at him was some things that stood out to me, and I'm always looking at the time period in which these people are created, looking to see if there's any truth or, you know, what's the story behind some of their powers. So, for example, Luke Cage is wrongly convicted of a crime. He has to go to jail. And while he was in prison, he was experimented on. So that led me to start looking at the history of experimentation on Black communities. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, okay? And if you're not, this was done from 1932 to 1972, where—
We say that again?
Yes, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment.
Has anybody ever heard the name Tuskegee before?
Oh, yeah. I have to say, I'm older than all of you here, so this is a trip down memory lane for me. And I guess what I would say is that a lot of this is a reflection of society.
Exactly.
This is how society sees us. And I'm looking, I have not seen Luke Cage, but what it says to me, just that picture by itself, is the image of the scary Black man. And so when I see this, and it's like, okay, here we go again.
Right.
So why can we not be seen as the real people we are? Exactly. And that's why we're having the problems that we're having today, because this keeps reinforcing the stereotypes and the fears that keep running through people's minds without any kind of correction whatsoever. So
yes,
thank you for this.
Oh, no problem.
One other question. What's the difference between comic books and graphic novels?
Well, basically, they're very similar. All right. So this is what happens with a graphic novel. Usually, in its beginnings, the idea was, how can I say, like the level of creativity, the level of thought that was put into it was a little bit higher than what you would find in a comic book. Okay. But because of the success of graphic novels, more and more comics started following that same pattern. So now you have comic books that are at that same level. And many of these graphic novels are actually being studied in high schools and universities across the US. So for example, Mouse, I'm not sure if you guys have heard of it, but Mouse is a very famous graphic novel that speaks to the Holocaust that took place in Germany, where you had the European Jews being portrayed as mice, and you had the Nazis being portrayed as cats. And then there was a whole play on that. You have another graphic novel that gets a lot of attention called The Watchmen, where they're looking at, where they're deconstructing the superhero and what that means. So basically what a graphic novel in its most general sense is like an elevation of your standard comic book. So that's basically what it is. Today, they really, go back and forth, and sometimes graphic novels are nothing more than a bunch of comic books put together. But at its beginning, that's
I'm just a retired teacher. That's why, it's like when they started introducing graphic novels and I watch them, it's like, wait a minute, I grew up with this when I was a kid, and they were comic books back then. So, okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
No problem. Yeah, so with Luke Cage, what I found interesting was the film actually does a lot to correct some of the things you just mentioned.
Okay, good.
Okay? So what happens is when the comic was first created, you have this Black character who was put in jail for a crime he didn't commit. He was framed. And while he was in prison, he was experimented on. So like I said, it began to question and look at the history of experimentation on Black communities. So one of the first and most famous would be the Tuskegee experiment. I say it's the most famous, not the first. Most famous would be the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And for those of you that are not familiar with it, Tuskegee is a town in Tuskegee, Alabama. Okay, I also went to Tuskegee, so shout out to HBCU.
And it's an all-Black college. Got to get that in. It's an HBCU.
HBCU, yes. So I attended Tuskegee, so I've always been fascinated with everything about Tuskegee. From the Tuskegee Airmen on the good side to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment on the horrible side. So with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment from 1932 to 1972, you had this experiment where they wanted to see what would happen if syphilis was to go untreated on Black male populations. because the idea was that the black brain and the white brain were not the same. So they wanted to see whether or not black people would react to syphilis the same way white people would. So what they did was they gathered these black men who had contracted syphilis. There is some strong speculation that some of them were given syphilis, but we definitely know that these men had it. And they were told they were being treated, but in reality, they were not. They were given placebos, and they simply wanted to see what would happen if they allowed this disease to like thrive. So you have this situation where these men, if you're not familiar with syphilis and what it can cause blindness, mental illness, and all those types of debilitatory situations. So,
and not to take you off rail, but just following up with that, that's the same issue we're having with the COVID-19 vaccine.
Exactly.
Folks have not forgotten that.
Yes.
And I've even had, you know, some folks I know very well in the black community have told me that, oh no, they'll put one thing in the white syringe and something else in the black syringe.
Yes.
And so they can't get volunteers because of this very thing. There's so much, a high level of distrust because of all of this.
So there's a long history behind it. So when you hear people in the black community that are concerned, it's not coming out of thin air. There's a reason for it. As a matter of fact, I forgot the 2 HBCUs, but you had 2 HBCU presidents that were trying to encourage the student body to actually partake in these COVID trials, and they actually came under a lot of fire for that. And that's one of the reasons, okay? So in looking at Luke Cage, I actually found out that there's a long history of black experimentation on black inmates as well, okay? And there's an excellent book called Medical Apartheid that speaks to this long history and this increasing and growing distrust in the beginnings of it between the black community and the medical community. And it does a great job of showing these experiments and explaining why you have this distrust. So Luke Cage in the comics, he volunteers for this experiment, and as a result, actually gains superpowers. But in the real world, when black folk were being experimented on and so forth, you have death, you have debilitation. As a matter of fact, in Tuskegee, if you are a descendant of someone that participated in Tuskegee syphilis experiment, it's actually noted on your medical ID card. So to this day, you still have people that are walking around that are feeling effects of this experiment, and it was brought to light in 1972 by a reporter. Excellent book out there called Bad Blood that really speaks to that particular event. So fast forward to Luke Cage. Luke Cage gains the power of not only incredible strength, but also still hard skin. So I began to look at, as Ms. Pickett had mentioned, when you talk about the stereotypes, I began to look at what is this about black strong men being bulletproof? What is that about? So I actually found that for a period of time in this country, they actually believed that a black man would have bulletproof skin if he did cocaine. They actually believed that you needed a gun stronger than .22 caliber to pierce his skin. And around the same time that this myth was being promoted, the police increased the caliber of weapon from 22 to 38. There's an excellent book called Black Robes, White Justice, okay, where he talks about this. So I began to say, okay, there's something here. In his original uniform, Luke Cage had a silver tiara around his head, he has chains around his waist, and he has silver on his wrist in his original incarnation coming out of the 1970s. When I looked at that, it was a play on the old stereotypes. I'll show you an image of him in a moment in the comic books. And I began to feel that in the 1970s when they first created him, in as much as they were trying to create this black superhero, they were still playing on the stereotypes. Fast forward to Netflix version of Luke Cage, where you have black voices and creators behind the camera. They dismantled a lot of those stereotypes that were found in the original comic books. Because I can tell you, there's no way they could have presented Luke Cage the way he was presented in the comics on Netflix without it being a problem. They had to make a lot of changes, okay? Another change, if you've seen the series, Luke Cage is followed around by this young black man with a camera. He's always videotaping him, putting him out on YouTube or whatever the case might be, and his name is DW. That name was actually a white character in the comic books, and his name was D.W. Griffith. Now, the name D.W. Griffith, if you're familiar with him, he's the guy that's responsible for Birth of a Nation, which came out way back in 1915. So you had this white character in the comics who worked in a movie house named D.W. Griffin. It was a play on D.W. Griffin. So when you get to Netflix, they just call him D.W. if you watch and listen to the character's name. If you're familiar with this film, and once again, when we talk about the impact of film. Yes, Jeremy.
Hang on, Will. Sorry, fellow. Just as I know you know this, but a fellow former history teacher.
Yes.
I just want to leave it to our high school students here. Has anybody learned about D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation? It was actually, it's considered by many people to be the first large-scale American film.
Yes.
Does anybody know what Birth of a Nation is about?
Not the modern version with Nat Turner, but the original.
No, absolutely not that. Any of my students, have they ever seen anything about Birth of a Nation? You might have learned about it in American history class.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's talk about it.
All right. Sorry, just figured I'd give you a chance.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's talk about it. What happens is in 1915, this film is released called Birth of a Nation. It's based on a book called The Klansman. All right. In this film, it depicts, it's a fictionalized account of Reconstruction about the time period after the Civil War. In the film, it gives the appearance that Black people had taken over the South and they were mistreating the white people in the aftermath of the Civil War. So as a result, the Ku Klux Klan had to be created to come to the rescue. So in the film, you have these Black characters that are vilified. You do have some Black actors, but you also have some white actors in blackface in this movie, okay? And the Black people are vilified, and the Ku Klux Klan, they're actually the heroes of the movie who come to the rescue to save the white community. The reason why this film is so significant for a couple of reasons. As Mr. Jeremy just stated, this was a blockbuster for its time period. This was the first film to be shown at the White House, okay? Also with this film, it led to the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan were born in the aftermath of the Civil War during Reconstruction in Pulaski, Tennessee, but they had kind of died out by the time you get to the 1900s. When this film was released in 1915, because white audiences were so enraged by what they saw, it actually led to a sharp increase in the number of Ku Klux Klansmen. And you had this resurgence taking place coming out of Atlanta, Georgia, okay? So 1915, this film goes a long way in bringing back the power and the strength of the Ku Klux Klan. You had Black people being attacked in the streets after they went to watch this film because they were so outraged by what they saw. Yes, Trinity.
So you know how you just said the Ku Klux Klan, they were like the heroes in the book?
Yes, yes.
I believe in the Harriet Tubman film, they made the slave master like the hero in that movie.
Yeah,
it came out last year.
Mm-hmm. I know exactly what you're talking about. A lot of people were put off by that film in the one scene where it looked like she was about to be killed, and then you're talking about the white slave owner comes to her rescue, so to speak. A lot of people found that problematic. I had taken a bunch of students to go see that. We talked about that film, and a lot of them had problems with that scene. What you're talking about actually is a trope in film known as the white savior. Just like you have the magical Negro that I mentioned earlier, you also have this trope in film called the white savior. And now that more and more people are becoming aware and they're noticing this, people are being called to task for these types of film. And there's a whole list of them. You see all of these films where you would have these white characters that will come to Black communities, that would save the Black community and so forth, where the Black community is not capable of saving itself. And that scene for a lot of people is problematic just for that reason. Excellent point, thank you. So in 1915, with the heroes of this film being the Ku Klux Klan, you have this resurgence of the Klan, okay? And what happens is the NAACP and other organizations really pushed to get this movie banned in the theaters. So I just want to give you a little bit of background, because when we see films, a lot of times, especially if it's for entertainment value, if it's a comic book, if it's science fiction, if it's fantasy, many times this is when people send like the most messages when it's those kind of films, because they know you're just looking at it for the superheroics, for the robots, for the explosions, but this is when they can send the most messages. So like I said, these filmmakers must have been aware of the history of the white character D.W. Griffin and D.W. Griffith and changed it up for Luke Cage. So also in Luke Cage, where I began to notice in the television series, they dealt with issues of colorism, okay, where the main villain was in the comics, they she was known as it's coming in a moment. She was Black, it was like Black Mom or something like that. And what happens is they called her that because she was a dark-skinned character, and they brought attention. Black Mariah, that was her name. Black Mariah in the show. In the comics, they called her Black Mariah, and she was a play on the stereotype of the large Black woman, the loud Black woman. But on the Netflix series, they used it to talk about issues of colorism. So they called her Black Mariah on the show, and she is outraged. She's like, I'm not playing this colorism game. So the filmmakers they were sensitive to what had taken place in the 1970s and made alterations by the time you get to the big screen. Okay, so like I said, that's a copy of my book where I'm talking about these characters and so forth. And like I said, this is like, you know, I'm working on the second one actually, where I'm continuing to look at and examine the role of Black creators in Black comic books and film, television, and so forth. And like I said, taking that passion, that's what it results in. So we look at some other characters. So if you look, this is the comic book, the original comic book image of Luke Cage. And if you look at him, you can see the silver tiara, the silver bracelets, the chain around the waist. A lot of this, in terms of the optics, harkens back to slavery. If you're familiar with the institutions of slavery, they had devices similar to these to enslave African folks, all right? So I just found it interesting that they chose this type of a costume for this character, okay? Another one, Papa Midnight. I don't know if you guys watch Constantine or read DC Vertigo comics, but there's an interesting character, it is also in the movie, the television version, called Papa Midnight. And what I found interesting with him was, in the comic books, he is basically a voodoo priest. And he gained his powers, strangely enough, by killing his sister and condemning her to hell. And he made an exchange where if he sent his sister to hell, demons would grant him power. So what ends up happening is a Black author, okay, he sees this by the name of Matt Johnson. He reads his story and he finds it highly problematic. So he takes over and he reintroduces Papa Midnight and he changes his origin story, okay? Because what he recognized was, and I read some interviews by him, you know, most often voodoo is still seen as, you know, this evil thing, this quote unquote Black magic. And what he wanted to do was bring respect back to it, because if you're familiar with voodoo, it's no different than any other actual religion. It's just that because you have these African influences, you have these Caribbean influences, okay? In some cases, Latino influences, depending on, you know, which direction you're going with it, it became demonized. So he goes back and he looks at the history of Papa Midnight and he changes it up for the purpose of the comic book. And he puts Papa Midnight in the historic position of being part of slave rebellions. If you study the history of slave rebellions, you're going to find in many, if not all, somewhere in a leadership position was a religious figure. Now, the religious figure may have been practicing Christianity, as you had with Nat Turner and Delmar Vesey. You have Boukman in the Haitian Revolution, who's a voodoo priest. But he realized that spirituality was part of every slave resistance movement in this country, somewhere in the leadership. So he puts Papa Midnight in the proper context, and he alters the original origin story that the writers had given him when he was first introduced, because once again, he recognized and was sensitive to the stereotypes, okay? So with Papa Midnight, when he's reintroduced, like I said, he's shown as being part of these actual slave rebellions, but he's part of the Great Negro Plot. If you go back and look at that history, he's placed in that context where he was supposed to have protected the people as they were rebelling, but he fails in that duty. So he's punished, and part of his punishment is basically to walk the earth eternally, okay? So these are the kind of things that, for me, this allows me to show a comic book image to young people and then get into history and be able to talk about it. In case, like I said, I'm able to bring those two worlds together, all right? Storm, 1975. I'm sure you guys have seen or heard of her. X-Men films, big little screen cartoons, you name it. She's introduced in 1975 because what happened was the X-Men, as popular as it is today, was actually failing when it first came out. This book was not popular, okay? It was so unpopular, they were simply reprinting old issues. So you had some creators come together, Dave Cockrum and Lin Wynn. They came together and they reintroduced the X-Men and made them more universal. So in the original incarnation of the X-Men, you simply had 5 white characters, okay? And they were all from the United States. When they reintroduced the X-Men in the 1970s, they made them universal. So now you get Wolverine, who's from Canada. You have Thunderbird, who's a Native American. You have Colossus from Russia. You have Nightcrawler, who's German, okay? Cyclops is still from the old group. He's from the United States. You had Sunfire coming out of Japan, and you have Storm being introduced coming out of Kenya. So I began to look at her history and began to look at, because in the comics, she's not only a mutant, person born with special abilities, she's also within her lineage, part of basically like this magic line within her family. So I began to look at African spirituality and the role of women in the continent and in African spirituality. And you have this creation of Storm. Storm initially was actually supposed to be a cat. And they actually changed her to a full woman. That's why when you look at her eyes, you can see they have like the cat-like eyes in her original incarnation, because she was actually going to be a feline character, and they changed her up. And they based the body type off of Uhura from Star Trek. I don't know if you guys watched the old Star Trek series, but that's where they get the look of her in terms of her figure. Mr. Jeremy.
Yeah, sorry, two things real quick. First of all, those of you who may not know, Lieutenant Uhura on the original Star Trek was actually one half of the couple of the first interracial kiss on public television between her and the canonical William Shatner.
Exactly. Exactly. And
once what? Yeah. But I also wanted to just say, whenever you get a moment, Mr. Will, I believe it was it Michael Dupree? Nicoy, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Had a question.
Oh,
well,
please. Yeah, didn't show up. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
So, so he just said, doesn't she play a part in the Black Panther comics, and how does that integrate?
So what happens is when you get to more recent times, you have her being introduced as a love interest. This just happened, okay? She was not introduced as a love interest until like the 2000s. Up until that time, there was no history between them. When you have Black writers that had taken over and began to write her, talking about Christopher Priest and Reggie Hudlin, began to write the character, that's when you start to see this connection between Storm and the Black Panther. And for a while, it actually broken the couple up, but then they brought them back together in the most recent incarnation. So some people, unfortunately, you know, we've lost Chadwick Boseman. So some people really wanted to see the Black Panther get with Storm on the big screen. Maybe they'll keep the character going with a different actor, but unfortunately we lost Chadwick Boseman. So who knows if that's going to happen. But yes, there is the history between those two. All of the hands are not showing up, so is there another question?
Yeah, I actually have a question for you this time, Will. Just a quick one. You know, in terms of the demonization of voodoo, have you found any kind of in the topic of intersectionality, have you found any correlation between the demonization of voodoo, you know, internationally, but especially in the United States, and the demonization of, I know it's probably 100 years beforehand, but like the demonization of Wicca and the desire to just take power away from women in general, and women of color specifically, but women in general, and power being a threat to the patriarchy?
Yes. So in terms of, well, in the case of Storm, you do have like what would be considered witchcraft and so forth as part of her lineage. So let's speak about that since you brought it up. When you look at the history of witchcraft, it is an attack on women. Okay, when you talk about the witch trials and so forth, whether it was in Europe or in the United States, you did have a few men that were considered witches or warlocks, but it by and large was an attack on women. Because what happened was, it was interesting, the same things that women were being celebrated for before you get to the Middle Ages, being the healers, being the caretakers, being able to concoct all these medicines and so forth. When you start to get to the age of the witch trials, now they're being demonized for those very things, okay? When we bring it over here to the United States, the witch trials actually started with a false accusation by two girls against an enslaved woman that worked in their home. They said that she had put a spell on them and that she had done some things to them and so forth. And at the time, it took very little to get a guilty verdict, if you will, of a woman being accused of witchcraft. It pretty much started and ended with an accusation. And it started with the accusation of a Black woman who was said to be practicing witchcraft. So what you have here is, and also if you notice when you talk about witchcraft, you do have that term Black magic. So it becomes racialized in many ways. And also voodoo in and of itself is also deemed as black magic. So it's put in the same sphere, if you will, for some of the same reasons. We have these marginalized groups, because when I say it started with the accusation of a black woman, it didn't end there. It ended up, impacting white women as well. But you do have these marginalized groups that are now being persecuted and feared under the guise of spirituality and religion. And oddly enough, the Salem witch trials ended when you had a woman of a higher class being accused of witchcraft. And so, hold on now, we can't go around killing rich white women. We can't do that. So that's when it began to wane. And also you start to have the advent of the scientific revolution also went a long way in alleviating the Salem witch trials. Yes.
That was also a part of the fear from the Christian community,
yes.
that you can't deal with this. This is not okay. So you throw in the religion, you throw in the politics, you throw in the racism, and you see a little bit of everything coming together that gets folks killed. Yes. And it's not, it's interesting. It's not unlike what we're seeing today with people calling 911 and reporting black folks living their life.
Yes.
And folks just reacting inappropriately and people losing their lives behind that.
Exactly. Okay. Now, what I don't want to, I can keep going because I have a lot of stuff I can share with you guys, but I wanted to get an opportunity to, yes, Michael Dupree, what you got?
You talked about this in like the beginning of the meeting, but how were your experiences traveling to other countries like Croatia and the UK?
Oh, excellent. So what happened was when I went to the UK, I actually had gone there to study civil rights at the University of Cambridge. I went there for a summer. And as part of what we had to do in studying it, we had to in turn do presentations to the faculty and so on and so forth. So once again, I went to what I love. Like I said, that mantra, if you will, has always rung true for me. It's always worked out. And I pointed out the connections and intersectionalism of these films and race and racial attitudes. And it was welcome, it was accepted, it was appreciated. So that went a long way in kind of confirming that I was on to something. And for Croatia, that was a great experience. I think that's probably one of the spots that most people don't think of when they think of going to hang out or going on vacation. I would tell anyone, if you can get to Croatia, make sure that you do. It's a beautiful place. As a matter of fact, I don't know if we got any Game of Thrones fans out there, but I was in the same town where they shot Game of Thrones. So we went in the castle and I was so excited because I was in the castle where they actually shot Game of Thrones and so forth. And they talked to us about how they would board off the neighborhood when it was time to shoot the series. But yeah, like if you go there, they got Game of Thrones, everything. So once again, I went there and I was in the same space with other scholars, and I was able to present on much of what I'm showing you today. And I was really taken back by the response that I had gotten from it. So I had a great time in both places. And like I said, Michael, what is it that you're interested in? What is it that you're interested in pursuing?
Film and media studies.
Excellent. So I would, I will give out my information because as a matter of fact, tomorrow I am hosting a virtual kickoff. A friend of mine who is a filmmaker, we've come together and we've done a film festival and comic book convention. We were supposed to have it tomorrow in Maryland, but COVID happened. So we're just doing it virtually. And next year, if all goes well and everything's back to normal, whatever that means, we're going to have it in Maryland, and we're looking for people who've already submitted films for our film festival, and we have vendors we're looking for more. So if you give me your information, I can put you in touch with my friend. His name is Chad Eric Smith, and I'm inviting all of you to check out our kickoff. It's called GrioCon. As a matter of fact, the logo is backward, but you can see there GC, that's what it stands for. It's called GrioCon. Griot is G-R-I-O-T. And if you're not familiar with the word griot, it is a storyteller coming out of African culture. And for us, filmmakers like yourself, comic book artists, artisans, creators are the modern day griots, the modern day historians. So this is a convention for us to highlight those people. So Mr. Jeremy.
I'll make sure to share that out on our Google Classroom as well as our
Awesome.
base account, so that
Awesome.
anybody who wants it will have it available to them whenever they want to tune in.
Yes, and I will also, you can, if any student is interested, like Mr. Dupree, if you're interested, you can give him my email information, and any way I can help you, I will do that. All right. So yeah, I've talked a lot. So let me hear from some folks out there. What are we interested in? What do we, you know, because I love, when I was looking up the program and what the program was about, I love the focus on, you know, the next step after school. So I wanted to get an idea of what directions you guys were headed in, or what kind of questions you might have about my experiences in any way that I might be able to help you. So anyone want to share what they're interested in, what they want to do?
I don't want to monopolize, but I do have a question.
Please.
Is there any discussion about correcting history? When you look at the history books that are used in education today, yes, it gives me a migraine headache.
Yes.
Is there a way to use the graphic novels to correct history? Is there anyone who's taking it from 1619 and bringing it up in a graphic novel format so that kids can actually get educated about, because I'm still reeling from the happy slave dancing around and having a good time. You know, so is there anybody dealing with that piece of it?
A few books that come to mind. There was actually a graphic novel done on the life of Nat Turner that I think was excellent. And it incorporates a lot of what you're talking about. The book, The March, is an excellent one that talks about civil rights.
Yeah, that was Senator John Lewis, right?
Yes, yeah, just lost him, and fortunately he was able to get that out. Actually, you know, and this is more political commentary, but the Boondocks, the newspaper strip, has actually been compiled into several graphic novels, and I think that would be a great source of conversation for young people. But there are several, there's a growing number of artists and writers that are taking the history and bringing it to graphic novels. So there's a lot, and I can send you a list when we're done, because trust me, it's way more than you might expect, but there are a lot out there that are doing that. Okay, great question. Any other students have any questions about what it is they're looking to do? Trinity, I heard from you earlier. I'm just curious, what are your interests? What is it you're looking to do?
I want to be a neurosurgeon. I want to be chief of neurosurgery.
What was that?
I want to be chief of neurosurgery.
Excellent, excellent. So I would take it now that your strengths would be science and math at this point, right?
Science, not necessarily math.
It's also
at it, but I like science a little.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, by all means, you know, you want to pursue that. So, where are you in terms of your academic ladder? What grade are you in?
Say that again.
What grade are you in?
Oh, I'm a freshman.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So yeah, by all means, AP courses. That's what you want to make sure you get under your belt. Okay. Let's see. I see a 9. Is this people that are asking questions? Let's see. All right. Any other? Okay, I see email, John. I'll take that down. Any other questions? Any other comments from anyone? Like I said, I want to hear from you guys on what you're interested in and what you want to do.
Will, I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Will. Is that, if I'm going to share out your contact information, is that Gmail address the one
you can use that? That's fine.
That's fine? Okay,
yep.
Thank you.
That is fine. Okay. So yeah, like I was saying, actually going back to the question that was raised by Ms. Pickett, this is a way for me to correct history by pointing these things out with the characters. And I like using these characters because these are the ones that people are most familiar with. So I use these characters to tell different stories, okay? So for example, oh, did I go too bad? All right. We look at, you know, the Black Panther coming out in 1960s, 1966. Many people think that they talk about the Black Panther Party, and I get an opportunity to talk about who they were and how the Black Panther Party actually got its name from a Black Panther organization coming out of Alabama. So it gives me an opportunity to talk about the history of the organization as well as the character. Most people don't realize that in 1966, Marvel actually created the Black Panther. These were white creators that had come up with the concept of the Black Panther. Today, you know, we look at these black writers and filmmakers that have taken the character and taken it to the next level. But it starts off with Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. What's interesting with the Black Panther was they were actually afraid to introduce him as a black character. And one of the earlier designs, you could actually see his face, but they changed the design because they were afraid that if people saw a black superhero on the cover, that they wouldn't buy it. Because just a year previously, there was a comic book called Lobo. It was a Western comic that was put out and by Dell Comics. And this company almost went out of business because they had a black character on the cover. He was actually the first black character to lead a comic by name in the title. His name was Lobo. And they actually, when the comic went out and stores saw that this black character was on the front cover, they sent back all of the comics. And only 2 issues were ever printed before they had to cancel the run. So by the time you come to a year later, 1966, Marvel was afraid that the same thing might happen. So they actually changed it to where his entire face was covered. And they were also afraid that people would connect the Black Panther to the Black Panther organization. Okay. So what they did was, for a brief time, they actually changed his name to Cold Tiger. And nobody was buying that. So they switched it back to the Black Panther because they actually, you know, they were afraid that people would make the connection between the Black Panther and the Black Panther organization. So once again, these are the kind of things that this gives me an opportunity to talk about and point out to people. Mr. Jeremy? Oh, okay. So
No,
like
sorry,
I said-
just enthusiastic.
Oh, okay. So these are just some of the things that I talk about as relates to popular history, culture, comics, and so forth, and history. And like I said, this gives me an opportunity to speak to organizations and groups like this and talk to you young people. So if you have any questions, Mr. Jeremy, like I said, you can give out my email address. But like I said, tomorrow I invite all of you to join me on Facebook Live as well as YouTube. It's called GrioCon. And you guys can check it out. We have a young man who's working for Nickelodeon coming to visit us, who's I don't know if you've ever seen Rise of the Mutant Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He's the artist, the storyboard artist behind that. And we also have some independent authors and comic book creators that are going to be joining us as well. So I can't say it enough. Thank you so much, sir, for bringing me out. I really, really appreciate it.
It's our
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This
So-
was amazing, Mr. Jones. I am definitely a Marvel fan, but this was a lesson that
That's right.
I couldn't have. This is like being in a class at the university. So
Thank you.
this is incredible. This really, really is. I think that, you know, we have some silent students on here, but I know we're going to get some feedback.
Mhm.
And you know, just again, I can't thank you enough for being here. This has been, this is my favorite speaker because I love Black Panther. You know, I always said the whole, you know, we took the kids to see Black Panther. I am like the Marvel junkie in the bunch, and we would go and see Marvel movies because it's just something that, you know, my family and I did, and I would try to share that with school to career students. So this is awesome. You know, this, if nobody else had a great time, I know we did.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really
This is incredible.
appreciate it. Yeah, and if any questions come up, you know, later on or whatever, I'd be happy to answer those. So you can forward that to me as well.
I have your Facebook up now. I'm gonna be watching tomorrow.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, 3 to 5.
Already.
3 to 5.
So
Thank you.
I appreciate the book list that you're going to get to us. We do
Yes.
encourage our students to, you know, research and read. My executive director is not on the phone, so I'll say that if the students are interested in getting your book, we will
Mhm.
definitely purchase that and send them that book through Amazon or through your site, however you know, provide that information. So look, one is gone. I'm spending money.
I actually just wanted to let everyone know I did put Mr. Jones's, Mr. Will's contact information, email address, website, and the Amazon link to his book, as a matter of fact.
Thank you.
I hate giving Amazon more traffic, but I love giving Mr. Jones more traffic.
Thank you.
Exactly.
I also want to make sure all of our CEOs know the Friday Speaker Series journal for today was just posted to the Google Classroom with a Monday due date. Please do not forget to do that.
All right.
So again, CEOs, we will buy that book for you. I'm not mad at Amazon. I own stock and I'm not mad about it because it's doing wonderful things right now.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
That's a deal with the devil.
I don't care. And if you purchase on Amazon, you can donate to Oakland Planning and Development. It comes directly to School to Career. So there is a win-win here.
Just make sure you log in through smile.amazon.com.
Exactly. And select OPDC. So we will get it back to our kids. But I'm definitely buying the book personally. So if any of the students want to make that purchase, or interested, just send me a text or respond on BAN.
Hanukkah present.
No.
All right, CEOs, can we please have a big round of applause or some ESL hand waves for Mr. Jones for taking the time?
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking forward till tomorrow.
All right, thanks. Thank you.
All right, have a great evening.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.